Oh, yay, Lydia's in.
Yeah.
Okay, so we need you to let attendees in. Oh, and here they come. Hi, participants.
Can you guys hear me
Welcome.
okay?
Yes,
Sorry.
Lydia, you
Sorry.
sound great. Apologies to everyone coming in. We had, tech snafu. It has to happen once a year. This is this year's time. Let's hope it doesn't happen again. We're going to go ahead and get started super pronto. Take a look at I'm Karen Westwood, Director of the Hennepin County Law Library. Welcome to this Friday's CLE on changes to voter eligibility. We have a great CLE coming up in June. Take a look on the Law Library website, but I am not going to waste any more time. I'm going to hand it over to Lydia because I know that you all came to hear her. So she's with Voter Outreach and Engagement for Hennepin County. And thank you so much for your patience as well, Lydia, and take it away.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks, everyone. My name is Lydia McComas, and I will start by sharing my screen here. There we go. Let me know if you can't see here. Second, share. There we go. Okay, so my name is Lydia McComas, and like Karen said, I lead voter outreach and engagement for Hennepin County elections. I've been with Hennepin since 2017, and I'm really excited to talk to you all about Restore the Vote and the expansion of voter eligibility for people on parole and probation. So let's get started here. This is our agenda for the day. So we will briefly talk about felon voting rights, the history of felon voting rights before we chat about what the current laws are across the country. And then we'll dive into really the meat of the presentation today, talking about Minnesota's current eligibility law, the process that we use to administer that law, and then the new eligibility law, the law that's going into effect on June 1st. We'll chat about what that language is, what the impact is, how we're getting the message out, as well as some of the other laws that we've passed this session, or that the legislature has passed this session. And then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So let's dive into it. So this is so I'll give a brief history of felon voting rights, the history of disenfranchisement, and I do want to give a caveat to the section and this whole presentation that I'm an election administrator. I'm not a historian. I'm not a lawyer. So that's the perspective that I'm bringing to this. I'm just an election administrator. Trying to make sure that people know their rights to vote. So. But I want to make sure we have some background in some history of felon voting rights. So there's a long history of removing the right to vote from people who have committed a crime. This history actually dates back to ancient Greece, which is with what they call civil death. And there's a good article about this linked there. But that was when people lost all civil rights when they committed a crime. This practice was continued into the colonies in the US and through today. However, this expansion really blossomed or bloomed or exploded with the post-Civil War era. There's a quote from the Brennan Center report that is linked there that is, quote, "First, lawmakers, especially in the South, implemented a slew of criminal laws designed to target Black citizens, and nearly simultaneously, many states enacted broad disenfranchisement laws that revoked voting rights from anyone convicted of any felony," unquote. But still today, as mass incarceration skyrocketed in the 70s and 80s, these felon voting laws continue to disproportionately affect Black Americans. And actually today, 1 in 19 African Americans of voting age is disenfranchised because of criminal records. And that rate is actually 3.5 times that of non-African Americans. Around the country. So it is very much disproportionately affecting people of color in the United States. Let's go on. So what do felon voting rights look like across the United States? So nationally, around 2% of Americans don't have the right to vote because of their criminal record. That's a lot of Americans. That's like I say on the slide here, 4 million Americans don't have the right to vote because of their criminal record. 3 out of 4 people who are disenfranchised are actually living in their communities, having fully completed their sentence, or are who are remaining on supervision, on parole or probation. So a lot of people who don't have the right to vote are just in their communities, like you and me. They're out and being part of society. I do want to chat about the 4 types of voting laws in place. So the first one, and it's the least popular or the least common, is the bucket where the states where people never lose their right to vote. And that's the case in Maine, Vermont, and most recently, DC. The second type of law is states that implement a bright line law, and that's where people only lose the right to vote when they are incarcerated. Then their voting rights are restored once they are released from prison. This is the law that Minnesota just passed and will go into effect on June 1st here. 23 states have that type of law. The third type of law is states where people lose their voting rights while in prison, but also while on parole or probation for a period after their incarceration time. This is the law that we have in place until June 1st in Minnesota. Then the last and sort of more extreme, but it is the case in 11 states, are the states where people lose the right to vote when they commit a felony, either entirely, or they have to have a waiting period, or they have to have a governor's pardon or that kind of thing after their incarceration time. 11 states have that type of law. And in some of these states like Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee, actually 1 in 13 people is disenfranchised. That's a lot of people, 1 in 13. So there's a huge variety of felon voting rights across the country. And that's part of the reason why people get so confused about whether they can vote, whether their family or friends can vote because of their criminal status, is because it changes from state to state. So let's move closer to home, Minnesota. So this is the current eligibility law in Minnesota. So when you're registered to vote, or when you go to the polling place on election day or absentee vote, you affirm that you are a U.S. citizen, that you are at least 18 years old when you vote, you've been a resident of Minnesota for 20 days, and that you're finished with all parts of any felony sentence. So that includes parole and probation. That is the case until June 1st. The last 2 are that you can vote while under guardianship unless a judge has specifically revoked your right to vote. And then you cannot vote if a court has ruled you legally incompetent. So those will all stay the same. We do have a pre-registration for 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds that I'll chat about at the end. But that finished with all parts of felony sentence, that will change. And we'll talk about that in a few slides. I did also want to say that we have 3.5 million voters in the state of Minnesota, which is a lot of voters, and in Hennepin County, 800,000 of those are registered voters. So there's a lot of voters to implement these and administer these laws for. So I want to chat a bit about how we administer the current election law as it is until June 1st, and as it relates to people serving felonies. So Minnesota has the 4th highest rate of probation in the country. So there are a lot of Minnesotans who don't have the right to vote. Additionally, many of those who are serving supervision sentences, who are on parole or probation, their sentences are extraordinarily long. So we've encountered many people who don't even realize they're on probation or parole, or hardly have contact with their parole officer. And they're in their communities just like everyone else, and they don't realize that they're not allowed to vote. So how does our office determine who can vote under this current law? So actually each month our office and other county election offices receive a Department of Corrections report from the Minnesota Secretary of State's office. We are tasked with going through that report, looking up each individual's court record to determine if they are in fact serving a felony sentence. And then if the individual is serving a felony sentence, we challenge them in our statewide voter registration system. If the voter with a challenge then goes to their polling place, they are confronted by the election judge. Nicely, the election judge asks them if they're aware of the eligibility law and if they are indeed eligible to vote. If the voter then believes it's a mistake, if they are no longer serving probation or parole, they are allowed to vote. They swear an oath, they're given a ballot, and they're allowed to vote just like everyone else. Then after election day, that challenge is removed from their record. Once in a while, we do have people who either register or vote when they are serving probation or parole. And these violations are also listed on that monthly report that we receive. When we receive those reports and we find that they are accurate, we do gather the materials, so the voter registration application or the voter's signature certificate from the polling place, along with an affidavit, and we refer those to local law enforcement. If local law enforcement then believes that they should be charged, they refer it back to our county attorney's office. There are very few of these that actually get charged, but we do encounter those once in a while. We do expect to have many fewer violations, those types of violations, and a much shorter monthly report with this new law. We will still challenge voters who are incarcerated, but now we get to do the task of going through and unchallenging all of the people who have challenged felony on their record who are serving parole or probation, because they'll no longer be ineligible to vote. So I think we have around 6,000 records to go through for people in that situation who are registered to vote currently, who will be able to unchallenge on their records. But like I said, we do have around up to 16,000 Hennepin County residents who are on parole or probation. So we do want to get the word out and have people register and vote. So what does this new law that's going into effect June 1st look like? What does it say? So this is the text. The stricken is what it was. So the new law gives people the right to vote if they are not incarcerated. So if they are no longer incarcerated with a felony sentence, they are allowed to vote. This was signed into law back in, I think, end of March, but the effective date was signed into law with the Democracy for the People Act by Governor Walz on May 5th. So the date of effect is June 1st. Now this language is pretty vague. There's no real definition of incarceration in Minnesota election law or really anywhere in statute. So we really wanted to make sure that that could be defined so that it was very clear. It was a clear, bright line law to make sure that people who are out of prison are allowed to vote. So I think that the House is voting on 1813 right now, which defines incarceration. And here's that language. I'm not sure if it has been updated today. It may have been while I've been in this meeting, because they're talking about it today. But this is the language that defines incarceration for Minnesota election law. And it clarifies that people who are on work release, as well as people who are on home monitoring, will have the right to vote. So those are not deemed incarceration for purposes of Minnesota election law. We're hopeful that this will pass because I've got some posters and materials I've drafted up, and I want to finalize those ahead of June 1st. So hopefully this will pass soon. So what is the impact of this new law? This is the largest expansion of voting rights since the suffrage movements of the 20th century. Like I said, up to 55,000 Minnesotans will have their rights restored, and up to 16,000 of them are in Hennepin County. There will be a lot of work, there will be a lot less work rather, especially with those monthly reports for election administrators. There will also be a lot less confusion for election judges, as people who go to the polling places aren't incarcerated if they're at the polling place, so their criminal record should not be a factor in their eligibility. They will have to make sure that they're eligible. They have to make sure they're a U.S. citizen, at least 18 years old, and that their rights have not been taken away by a judge. But otherwise, they should be eligible to vote, and their criminal record will not be a factor in that. I also want to be clear that the road to this law passing has been long and windy. It's been on our legislative platform for a long time, but the key players were in line this year, and we were able to get it passed. We're really excited about that. So many states who have implemented this type of bright line law have found that it's really hard to engage people who have their rights restored. So it's really important that we get the message out. And there's actually a multitude of reasons why people aren't necessarily wanting to engage, including miseducation and mistrust in the system. Like I mentioned, there's lots of different laws across the country, and people get very confused about how they're impacted by their criminal record. So it's really important that we have a clear message. So our office has been coordinating with the Secretary of State's office, with other local election offices such as Ramsey County, our own cities, and counties across the state, to make sure that our messaging mirrors each other, that they are consistent, clear, and that we're just on the same page, so that voters don't get confused between our messages. We're also putting some money behind advertising and media, making sure that everyone gets this message, is very clear that there's a new law, and that a lot more people are going to be able to vote. We're hoping to do some bus signs, so we're in talks with Metro Transit about that too. And really pivotal, and something that we've been actually doing for the last several years, is relying on community partners. We know that community partners are often more trusted in their communities than we are as the government. So we've been working with trusted messengers to get this message out. And we've actually had a contract program since 2020, where we contract community organizations to do voter outreach work. So this year, even though it's an odd year and we don't have a ton of elections, we are contracting with 10 community organizations to do voter registration work and restore the vote outreach this year, which is really exciting. This work does not stop this year, even though this is the year that this law goes into effect. It does not stop here. We know next year is a even bigger election year. We're all getting prepared for it. And so we'll continue to get this message out as more people are inclined, or more people have elections to vote in next year. We're going to make sure that this is one of our top priorities in messaging. I also just want to briefly chat about some of the other election laws that were passed this year. Most of these were in the Democracy for the People Act, like I mentioned, that Governor Walz signed on May 5th. And this year was very much an odd year, really a pivotal year for election law. So these are some of the laws that got passed. So the first one is automatic voter registration. So that will change how people get registered to vote when they get their Minnesota driver's license or state ID. It'll be an opt-out system instead of an opt-in system as it currently is. So people who get their driver's license or IDs will be automatically registered. Now, the date of effect is July 1st of this year, but it will take a little while before it's fully ready. Our service centers and DMVs just have some some stuff they need to do before that's ready. The next one, which we're especially excited about, although we're really excited about all of these updates, is pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds. So this makes sure that that our young adults in the state are getting ready to vote, even though they can't vote yet. We're getting them ready because we know that not all young people get driver's license. I didn't get mine until I was 19, and that's where a lot of people register to vote. So if we can get people pre-registered, we can get into those high schools, get them pre-registered, they'll be more likely to vote. They won't face that barrier when they turn 18. So that will actually be one of the other updates on our voter registration application. So pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds and the felony status will change on the voter registration applications, which will be available on June 1st. And that goes into effect the same date as the Restore the Vote on June 1st. A couple other laws here. We have the law around permanently receiving absentee ballots. Currently, if voters want to receive absentee ballots for every election, they must be on a list to receive an application for a ballot, and then they receive an application before each election. We can't send out ballots automatically, but this law allows us to send out those ballots automatically to people who want those. That won't go into effect until next year, after the presidential primary, in the summer of next year. The next one is translation and interpretation requirements. So that ensures that we develop materials in languages other than English based on census tract data. It'll also make sure that we have interpreters at election day polling places based on those language needs in those precincts. That will apply to elections on or after next year. We're still, the OSS, the Secretary of State's office, is still looking into how we can implement that change. The last law, and then I'll open this up for questions from you all, is around intimidation and interference with the voting process. So this provides both civil and criminal penalties to stop intimidation or interference with the voting process, and the actions can be brought by the Attorney General, the County Attorney, or anyone injured by an act prohibited in that section of the bill. That date of the effective date is June 15th, and will apply to all violations on or after that date. That was all that I had. I went through a little fast and got a little, not a ton of time here right now, but I'd love to answer any questions I can. And if I can't, I can find them for you and get back to you all. Are there any questions from folks? Let me pull my screen big. There we go. Okay. Okay, so somebody asked, how is incarcerated defined? Does it include pretrial detention? Thank you. Yes. So no, pretrial detention should not be considered incarceration. Incarceration is in prison. You're being incarcerated for, you're being detained for your felony sentence. So likely people in jail will be allowed to vote because they're not serving their felony sentence in jail right now until June 1st, but we know we don't have any elections right now until June 1st, but in the past we have actually gone to the Hennepin County Jail, and people have voted from the jail because they were not serving parole or probation in the jail, and they were not yet convicted of those of that felony. Okay, let me open up the chat here. Got the Q&A section in the chat. Here we go. With permanent absentee ballots, how do you keep those records current so that you're not sending ballots to the wrong address? Yes, that's a great question, and that's part of the reason why it's going to take us a little time to implement that law. the thing is, though, that does happen when we send out absentee ballots now, that sometimes people move or they get sent to the wrong place. And when that happens, either the post office returns it to our office, and we see that there's a yellow sticker on there saying return to sender. And then we update the person's record saying that they're not where they said they lived. If somebody receives a ballot meant for you, they would have to write. It's very hard for somebody to write all of your information on there to submit the ballot on your behalf. They would have to have all of your ID numbers. They would have to have your date of birth, your address, that kind of thing. So there's while we do want to make sure that absentee voting is secure, and we will make sure that it is secure, that's not as big of a concern around that, because there are lots of checks and balances to make sure that people are voting for themselves. Okay, I see a couple other chats. What happens when a defendant on probation gets revoked and goes back into incarceration? Yes, thank you. So I'll pull up the law here. So when somebody goes back into incarceration, then they can't vote. So if you go back into prison, you're unable to vote for just the period that you're incarcerated. And let me know if that answers your question. You can type in the chat or that kind of thing. Another question here. Oh yeah, does somebody want to answer that question? Okay. How does this cross state lines, i.e. would a felony conviction that disqualifies in Texas disqualify in Minnesota? And should a person with a Minnesota conviction in Texas not vote there? Yes, great question. So if somebody in Texas, if somebody in Alabama or Mississippi, Tennessee, that type of place where you can't vote when you're on probation or parole, comes and they live in Minnesota, the Minnesota election law covers them. So they're voting in Minnesota elections. It's that they have to make sure that they are under Minnesota, they're eligible under Minnesota election law. Texas election law does not apply in Minnesota, but vice versa. If you are serving parole and probation as of June 1st, you'll be allowed to vote in Minnesota. But if you go to a place like Tennessee or that kind of thing, and you're still on probation or parole, you have a new parole officer there maybe, then you would probably likely not be allowed to vote. Although I'm not an election administrator in that state, so you might want to, that person should check with their election officer or new parole officer. Are there other questions? And I can scroll up in the chat too. That is a good question from Scotty in the chat. I'm actually not sure about that one. That hasn't come up yet in our talks. The question is, so if you have an outstanding warrant but are not currently incarcerated, then it would not be a crime if you vote with an outstanding warrant. Yeah, I'm not sure about that. We'll have to chat with the county attorney's office to interpret the law. As this is a new law, there's lots of situations that we are not quite sure about yet, and as the definition gets passed yet. So that's a great question, and we'll figure that out. Thank you for bringing that up. Okay, so a couple other questions here. So I'm a little confused by this question. But it says, does the statute have a built-in furlough for EHM participants to go vote? Is that electronic home monitoring? I think that might be. Yes, so we have actually worked with home monitoring people in the county. I think there's a section of DOCCR who does that, and yes, they are allowed to go vote. We worked with them, especially in the past, around people who are not serving parole or probation, but they are allowed to go vote. Yeah. Another question: how do we keep records updated when I assume somebody is revoked and when they're out again. So like I said, so we get monthly reports from the Department of Corrections through the Secretary of State's office. So we get reports on whether somebody is incarcerated or not. So we challenge them in the statewide voter registration system if they are incarcerated, and then we get the report when they are not incarcerated. So we update it once they're not incarcerated. Another question, where can we go to get informational flyers to disseminate this voting information? Yes, thank you, Jenny. So we are still waiting for HF 1830 to get passed so that we have a definition of incarceration, because as the language is a little vague in the original law that was signed. So once we have that done, we'll have all of our materials up on our Hennepin County website. So it's hennepin.us/elections. And then in the outreach page, all the materials will be up around June 1st. It will take a little longer to get translations. We'll be doing translations in the top 5 languages in Hennepin County. It will take a little longer to do that, but all of our materials should be up by June 1st on our website. Okay, so another question was, is home monitoring considered incarceration? So no, with if HF 1830 gets passed today, it will not be considered incarceration. Yep, so that was one thing that we felt was vague around just the word incarceration, was around home monitoring. So if HF 1830 gets passed, then it will not be considered home monitoring. The same with work release. Work release will not be considered incarceration. So people in those situations will be allowed to vote. So there's a question here that's not super related to the content, so I don't know if I can answer it. I don't think I can answer it right now, but I'll state it, and I can get back to you when I chat with my coworkers. It's around, does your office have a position on laws that prohibit nonpartisan voters from voting for candidates in multiple partisan primaries, or getting rid of partisan primaries as California has done? I don't know that our office has a stance on that, but I can look into that and let you know. Another great question. In your presentation, you mentioned there are some people who, under the current law, vote when they aren't allowed. Do you have any figures on how many times this happens in an election? That is a great question, and the short answer is very, very, very few. We almost never have anybody charged or convicted with this type of violation. So it's a violation of voting while on parole or probation. That type of thing does not happen often where they're convicted. But we do have people who are on parole or probation vote or register to vote, and local law enforcement finds out that their parole officer never told them, never got the sheet of paper that has that information, and so then they can't be charged, or local law enforcement doesn't want to go ahead and charge them. So that does happen, but then they don't get charged, and that's out of our hands. We don't have a ton to do with that. We just give the materials to local law enforcement, but we don't have any. And I'll get a message from my coworker here in a second if I'm wrong. But we don't have anyone in recent years who has been convicted of that type of violation. Okay. So here's another question in the chat here. With applications for absentee ballots, you had the choice of entering your driver's license / state ID number or the last 4 digits of your social security number, but you had to remember which number you use when you vote. Or your ballot might be invalid. Has that been corrected? I don't believe that has been corrected, but we do chat with voters about potentially putting both numbers on both the application and their signature envelope, which is where that information goes on for their absentee ballot. But that I don't think that has changed. I don't know that we would necessarily want that to change. I think that's been working almost fine. We don't have very many absentee ballots that are rejected because of wrong numbers. And when we do, we contact the individual and chat with them, or we issue a new ballot. But we don't have a ton of rejections based on that. We do get a lot of people calling our office to double check that, though, and so I do know that that can be a burden for some people. Great. If there were any questions up higher in the chat, if you want to put them again lower, there's a lot in the chat with the CLE credits. I'm not seeing any other questions. My email is just my first name dot my last name at hennepin.us, and I can put it in the chat. If anyone has any questions, or if there are things that that come to you later and you want to chat with me, feel free to reach out. I lead voter outreach and engagement. So if you need voter registration applications, if you need handouts, we have a lot of handouts, or one great handout on voting with a criminal record, as well as voting in jail. So if that would be relevant to you or the people that you work with, let me know, and I can get that to you, or it's on our website at hennepin.us/elections. Yeah. Any last questions from anyone? Cool. Awesome. Thank you. Should I hand it back to you, Karen, or?
I think Karen might have left, but
Okay.
Thank you so much, Lydia. That was wonderful. And thank you everyone for attending. Again, apologies for the trouble at the very beginning with technology. But yeah, if there's nothing else, I guess everybody have a great day and great weekend.
Thank you, everyone. See ya.